system's rigged, man, it's time to break free. Eyes wide open, gotta see what I see. Standing on the front lines, fighting for the truth. Lift the veil of lies, it's time to be the proof. Take a stand, don't you back down. Raise your voice, let's shake the town. We're the voices that won't be ignored. Breaking chains, yeah, we're ready for war. With the power of the people, we'll make them see a world of justice, united and free. United and free. United and free. Marching with a purpose, we're taking it higher. Fighting through the struggle, igniting the fire. No more silence, we'll make the noise loud. Together in this battle, standing strong and proud. Injustice fades when courage aligns. Rise up together, break the
Please be seated. Please let me know when you're ready to proceed. All right, please state your full legal name and spell your name as well.
Full legal name is Samantha Whitney Coberly. The last name is spelled Coberly.
Okay. All right, and Samantha, Samantha?
Correct.
Okay, please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that any testimony you give today shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jury?
I am Dr. Samantha Coberly.
Where do you work now?
I currently am a forensic anthropologist contracting with the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency at Joint Base Pearl Harbor, Hickam.
You live in Hawaii now?
Correct.
What do you do on a day-to-day basis with the POW?
We are tasked with identifying the unaccounted for service individuals who have been lost in past conflicts. So I am the forensic anthropology analyst doing the work there.
How long have you been doing that kind of work?
Since 2021. It's about 3.5 years.
Can you describe for the jury your educational background and training that allows you to do that job?
Yes. So I was at University of Florida for my PhD, graduated in 2020. I also have bachelor's degrees in criminal justice and sociology. In addition, I've taken numerous classes in forensic anthropology, as well as my experience at the Pound Lab and at Wichita State University, where I worked in that lab as well. And then I've worked several years now at the DPAA.
So before you worked where you do now, you worked at the Pound Lab at University of Florida?
Correct.
What did you do there?
I was a forensic analyst. So what I would do is I'd be assigned a case. I would do the inventory, take photos, do any analysis that we have, which is biological profile, age, sex, ancestry, stature, any trauma analysis, time since death, pathology, antemortem that may help in identification, and all of that I would write in my report. At the time, I was also the lab coordinator, which meant I accessioned all the remains into the lab, and I coordinated with law enforcement and medical examiner offices.
Were you also an adjunct professor at UF?
No, I was an adjunct professor at Newman University.
I apologize. Thank you. Were you a part of any research programs in the area of anthropology?
Yes, so I've done a number of research primarily on gunshot trauma. My dissertation was on gunshot trauma to the postcranium, but I've also done work on gunshot trauma to the cranium, including looking at suicide versus non-suicide.
And the cranium is the skull?
Yes, just for kind of a vocab, the cranium is just the head without the mandible, and the skull is the mandible and the head.
Were you the recipient of any honors doing that kind of work?
I got a number of awards to help me towards my dissertation on that, so yes.
Have you also done research presentations and received grants to do the type of work you've been talking about?
Yes, I've presented a number of times at our national conference in various cities.
You've also been published?
Yes, I have published an article and hope to publish in the future.
When did you start at the Pound Lab in Gainesville?
2015.
You mentioned the term forensic anthropology. What does that mean? What does it involve?
So anthropology is basically the study of people. It's very broad, very large study, and it's split into basically 4 groups. You have like cultural, which is living people, archaeology, the past, and then we have biological anthropology, which is study of the body. And forensic anthropology falls under that because we're looking at basically the skeleton in order to help with our identification and help us to determine what happened to the individual. So we're looking at that kind of branch of the anthropological field as a whole.
During your work at the Pound Lab in Gainesville, were you the author of various reports on different cases that involved remains being brought to the Pound Lab for analysis?
Yes.
Did you also go out to some of the scenes, and assist in the excavation process?
Yes.
This time, Your Honor, I request permission to allow the witness to provide opinion testimony in the area of forensic anthropology.
Any objection?
No objection.
Or without objection, the request is granted.
When human remains were delivered to the Pound Lab at University of Florida, were they assigned a unique Pound Lab case number?
Yes.
And how are those case numbers structured?
They are a alphanumeric case numbers, so they have a number, which is the month in which it was received, a alphabet letter, and that's the sequence in which they were received in the lab, and then another number, which is the year. So in this case, it'd be 3C18, and it was the 3rd case in the month of March in 2018.
I'll lead your attention to March 22nd of 2018. Did the Pound Lab receive some human remains that were excavated from a location in Lake County, and did those remains come from the 5th District Medical Examiner's Office at Leesburg?
Yes.
And who was the medical examiner associated with that case?
Dr. Shaw.
How did those remains get to or arrive at the Pound Lab in Gainesville?
They were brought to us with an investigator from the District 5 office.
And was there a unique medical examiner case number associated with those remains as well?
Correct.
What was that number?
2018-00428 or 2018-0428. It was written differently in different areas.
Okay. Describe the remains that were sent to you.
So the remains that got sent to us are a nearly complete skeleton in good condition. The remains did have some soil staining, brown coloration, but otherwise very little post-mortem damage with that. They also, at the time, were fully skeletonized with no odor of decomposition.
And what's the significance of being fully skeletonized with no odor of decomposition?
This means that several months had passed by that point. It's gone through the entire decomposition process, and sometimes that smell will linger for a little bit, so we know it's fully gone in that. But we also know that they're still in good condition, because over time, bone does break down. We start to lose the cortical bone or the overlayer, you lose the ends of the bones, meaning it's still in good condition, but there has been fully decomped.
So in this case, the bones were still in good condition.
Yes.
And this may be an unfair question, but how long does it take bones to begin to deteriorate beyond the condition that you saw? Does that make sense?
Yes. So this is a complex question because it is very, very specific to a bunch of variables. Time of year, insect activities, soil acidity, all of that can affect these remains. I have seen remains here in Florida where you're looking at a decade and the bones are starting to break down and crumble. I've seen cases from Korea that are still beautiful. So it's very determinant on multiple conditions.
A lot of variables at play.
A lot of variables.
Is that why it's often difficult to give a precise date of when
Yes, that's why
the body was buried?
Yes, that's why we tend to give a pretty broad range.
Understood. You said that you received most of a skeleton. Were there some small bones that were missing from the skeleton?
Yes, predominantly in the hands and the body of the hyoid. These bones are pretty small, and ones like the ones in the wrist oftentimes can be confused with like stones.
What is a hyoid?
The hyoid is the one in your throat. So it's basically structured in there, and we found the greater wings of it, but not the body. So it's like the little U-shaped one that's in your throat.
You said those bones are very small and can
Yes.
sometimes be missed.
Yes.
Okay. Did those missing bones affect your ability to do an analysis in this case in any way?
No, we typically don't do analyses on these bones because they're so small, so we don't use them in biological profile. And I believe I have a statement in my report saying we can't determine trauma on those missing bones, but it's unlikely that they would have had.
We've heard a little bit about the femur bone in this case. Can you briefly describe what was done with the femur once you received it, what you did with it, and then when you sent it back?
So we received the femur, and I did a initial analysis on that. So what I did is I basically looked for any trauma, any pathology on it, both visually and microscopically. And then it was packaged in a bag and sent back with investigator Griffiths to be tested for DNA. We like to use bones that don't have any pathology or trauma on them when we send it for DNA. So this was an intact bone that got sent.
You saw no signs of trauma to the femur at all?
No,
And how did you determine that? Just by looking at it, or did you do some kind of microscopic analysis?
both. Generally, gunshot trauma to the femur is fairly noticeable. It tends to, when it hits the shaft, kind of explode. But I wanted to be thorough, and it could have been like the bullet passed briefly, so I looked at it under the microscope as well.
Found nothing.
No, I did not find anything.
How was the femur packaged and then to be sent back to the medical examiner's office?
It was placed in a bag with our medical or our case number on it.
I'm showing you, we only have a few photos in this. I'm showing you State's Exhibit, photo 15 of State's Exhibit 19. What does this show?
That shows the femur that was sent back.
Is that your case number 3C18?
Yes.
Is that your handwriting?
That is.
Okay. And did you also send a letter to the medical examiner's office indicating
Yes.
basically, here's your femur back?
Yes.
Based on your analysis of all of the bones and the condition of them, you said there's a lot of variables that play into this decision, but were you able to give a rough estimate of how long the body would have been buried?
Yes, I gave the estimate as several months to several years prior to arrival at the Pound Lab.
Were you able to tell the gender of the person that the bones?
Yes.
How?
I looked at the hip bones, which is one of the most diagnostic areas for telling male versus females. We have basically morphological or shape differences between the two. And looking at those, I was able to determine that the individual was male.
Were you able to tell the approximate age of the person?
Yes.
Well, first of all, what was the approximate age?
It was young to middle age.
And what does middle age mean?
Kind of like mid to late 30s, early 40s in that case.
How do you determine that?
So age in adults is slightly more difficult than in children, because with children we're basically looking at how your body grows and how your epiphyses or those growth plates fuse. The last bone to fuse in the body is your clavicle or your collarbone, and about your mid to late 20s. He was fully fused, which means we know he had hit that about late 20 mark. After that, we basically look at how your body kind of deteriorates over time. So we look at changes. In this case, I used a method looking at the pubic symphysis, which is the two hip bones, the joint there that kind of rubs on that. And when you're young, it's all nice and billowy and pretty looking, and then as you age, it gets worn down. And so using that, I was able to get kind of a age range for this individual.
Were you able to determine an approximate or a parameter of the height of this person?
Yes. Using, oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I used the bones of the legs because those are what contributes to the height the most. It was put into a discriminant function analysis, and I was given a height range. looking at my report, it was a mean age of 66.1 inches, or about 5'6", with a range of 5'2" to 5'10". And we do a range because people can have different proportions to their bodies. They may have like a long torso and short legs, or long legs and short torso. So we like to give that range to get, and in this case, 95% of the population covered by this.
Are the remains consistent with being a male born on January 14th of 1982 and who had been killed and buried around November of 2015?
Yes.
Except for the skull that we'll talk about in a minute, did you find any evidence of trauma to any of the other bones that you examined?
No.
And how did you assess and look to determine if there was trauma?
I basically looked at every single bone in the body, one by one, to look if there was any fractures, any nicks, anything that could proportionally be perimortem trauma.
Perimortem meaning what?
At time of death.
And when you said you looked at each bone, did you look at both visually and microscopically?
Yes.
Any evidence of any trauma to any of the bones except for the skull, which we'll talk about in a minute?
No.
If there would have been some kind of trauma to any of the other bones, would you have been able to see that based on the condition of the bones?
Yes.
Did you see any evidence of, let's say, animal activity on the bones?
No. Here in Florida, it'd be either carnivore or rodent. And with carnivore, you see like teeth punctures and the ends of the bones. Think about like how your dog would eat on a bone. You'd be missing those portions. And with rodents, they use dry bone to grind down their teeth, so you get these like parallel striations on the bones. And none of that was seen on the remains.
During the course of your analysis, did you take some photographs of the bones?
Yes.
Showing what's been marked previously been shown to the defense counsel as states AA. Do you recognize the photos in that exhibit?
Yes.
Come through and look at them for me. And generally, what do they show?
They show the perimortem trauma to the cranium.
Do they fairly accurately depict the trauma that you talked about to the cranium or the
Yes.
skull?
Yes.
Okay. This time, state will move AA into evidence as states. I'm sorry, I don't remember the next.
23,
23, Your Honor.
24.
Thank you.
Any objection?
No objection.
Without objection, states AA will be moved into evidence as states number 24.
24. Thank you, Your Honor.
Yes, sir.
Explain to the jury the condition of the skull. I'm sorry, the cranium. I use wrong terminology.
So the cranium was fragmented. We can say comminuted, which means there's more than two fragments at the time. So there was the fragments. And on the back of the head, the occipital was a pretty well-defined defect.
And I'm showing you photograph 1 of states 24. Can you describe to the jury what you're talking about in light of what you just said?
So as you can kind of see,
If it'll help you step, with the court's permission, if the witness could step down and kind of demonstrate.
Certainly, you may move about the courtroom.
So we have a very well-defined, very circular defect here, and that is very typical of gunshot wounds. So it basically punctures in, and then we have associated with that is radiating fractures. So when it hits the cranium, it basically causes like a mini explosion, and the cranium fractures due to the high energy being spread throughout the cranium.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So here is the defect itself, a bone missing chip here.
That's okay. It's a touch screen. I didn't warn you. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the fractures that we see surrounding that gunshot entrance wound, were they caused by the gunshot entrance wound?
Yes.
Those aren't separate injuries because it was hit or something to that effect?
No.
How do you determine that?
With lots of study of gunshot wounds,
Okay.
basically. But like I said, what happens is the energy when it hits radiates outwards. So this versus say, blunt force trauma, you would see basically an indentation. Think of like a baseball bat hitting a window. You have that smushed in appearance and kind of a spider web weaving, versus this where you have the fractures kind of radiating outwards.
And did you become aware that Dr. Shaw, the medical examiner, actually recovered a projectile from the inside of the skull?
I did not know that at the time and discovered that later.
Okay. That's all obviously consistent with what you found, though, correct?
Yes.
Showing you photograph 2 of States 24. What do we see here?
This is the internal surface of the cranium at that defect. And why this is important is this internal beveling here, which is just like bone chipping that goes throughout. That is what shows us that it was an entrance gunshot wound, and that it was a gunshot wound. Because this is basically textbook example of that. It's basically when the projectile hits, okay, like a funnel in there, and so the bone around that is chipped out. If it was an exit wound, that bone chipping would be on the outer surface.
Did you locate any kind of an exit wound?
No.
Okay. Did you locate some projectile or bullet fragments inside the skull?
Yes.
I'm showing you photograph 1 of States 24 again. Where were those projectile fragments located when you looked through the cranium?
There is one located right here, and then a couple that are not shown in this photo here, which were in the facial region.
How'd you find them?
Visually. And radiographically after I noticed it visually.
And showing you photograph 3 of States 24. What do we see here?
So this is that loose bone that is right by the defect, and this is the piece of bullet that is right there, and it was removed during analysis and photographed.
And photograph 4 of States 24. What do we see here?
So I radiographed a number of the fragments once I noticed the fragment articulated. This is that same fragment again. You can kind of see in this photo the radiopaque kind of darker white spot. That is a bullet fragment. And then this is part of the facial region, the kind of in your sinuses. And there was another fragment.
Is that all consistent with the single gunshot wound to the back of the head and the bullet fragmenting and went up? Where do you
Yes.
go? Okay. And by radiograph, is that basically an X-ray?
Yes.
What did you do with those fragments?
They were placed in a bag and returned to District 5.
And showing you photograph 22 of States 19. Is this what does this photograph show?
The bag that was returned in sealed.
Does that also have your pound lab case number on it
Yes.
in your handwriting?
Yes.
Did you notice any other trauma? We've already talked about the other bones. But did any other trauma to the skull besides that single gunshot wound and the effects of that single gunshot wound?
No, all the trauma that was on the cranium could be associated with that defect.
Let's assume a second gunshot was fired into the same hole as the first. Just let's say that happened. Would you be able to notice that?
Yes.
How?
So think about all of the variables that go into the gunshot wound. Distance, angle of the person to the target, air resistance, did the bullet tumble? All of that affects it. If you're saying two separate shots managed to go through the same hole, means all those variables had to be identical. Even in cases where there's two gunshots, basically a colloquial term double tap, they tend to be oval shaped or figure 8 shaped defects rather than that perfect round hole.
And that's not what we have here.
No.
Okay. You got some thing. Did you see any evidence of blunt force trauma to the head?
No.
Let's write this down. Okay. Did you notice some post-mortem injuries to the ribs in this case?
Let me check my report real quick. Yes, there's postmortem breakage on multiple ribs.
Number one, how do you know it's post-mortem, meaning after death?
Yes. So with postmortem, the breakage tends to be different, less right angles, less curvatures, but also in this case we see color differences. As I mentioned before, the remains have been soil stained; they're brown in color, and when it breaks, those new break lines are the old color of the bone rather than the new color. So we can see those differences between the two.
When you say post-mortem, are you talking 10 minutes after death or months to years potentially after death?
Months to years. Basically, bone can remain green and greasy for a period of time after.
You said these bones were soil stained,
Yes.
but the areas of the post-mortem breakage to the ribs were not?
Yeah.
They were a different color?
Yes.
Is that consistent with those ribs breaking after the body had been placed in the hole?
I cannot speak to that, but most likely yes, because it would have happened after decomp.
Okay, so the body would have had to have decomposed before.
Yeah.
I understand. So it's not like those rib fractures could have been caused by somebody moving a body and.
Unlikely, no.
Okay. One moment, Your Honor.
Yes, sir.
I have no other questions. Thank you, Doctor.
All right, thank you. Mr. Wiggs?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Picking up on post-mortem,
Yes.
your position doesn't sound definitive as to all the ways in which post-mortem damage can occur to the ribs, correct?
Yeah, there's multiple ways in which postmortem damage can. However, if it was recent, oh, sorry.
Okay? It can occur in multiple ways,
Yes.
correct?
Correct.
Okay. Moving the body can cause post-mortem damage, correct?
No. It's still within the perimortem interval if it was within probably a couple weeks before that.
Okay. Say the body is moved after death. Can that cause injury or post-mortem damage to the ribs?
It can, but it will look like perimortem injuries.
Okay. Now, you received the body, or the body that you examined, it had been in a decomposed state, correct?
It was fully skeletonized when it arrived to us.
So you weren't able to analyze the body with any soft tissue upon it, correct?
Correct.
So logically, you weren't able to assess whether or not there was any injury or damage to the body in any other locations other than the fracture that you examined in the rear of the skull, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So there was some limitations on your ability to really conduct and reach the conclusions that you have, correct?
I was basically basing it on skeletal analysis, correct.
Okay. Well, you're speaking about the bones and the condition of the body. You made a statement that the body could have been dead for several months to several years, correct?
Correct.
And then the state represented to you, was it consistent, the condition, with the body having been dead from November 17th backwards, correct?
Can you rephrase that question?
The state used the date of November, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you gave an opinion on it, stating that the injuries or the body condition or the bone condition was consistent with the body having been dead from November 17th, I believe, backwards, correct?
I honestly don't understand your question, but
Okay. Could you date the date of death?
no, I'd have to give the range like I did.
Do you have any idea when the body, when Mr. Shaver died?
No.
Okay. So any representation, it died from this date backwards, you couldn't reach a conclusion on that, correct?
Correct.
Okay. One moment, please.
Yes, sir.
Have nothing further. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you. Any redirect?
When Mr. Wiggs started his cross-examination, he was talking about the ways post-mortem injuries could have occurred. He said you weren't real definitive. He started to give an answer. What were you going to say?
So basically, like I mentioned, when decomposition happens, the bones don't just like automatically become brittle and discolored from soil. That's a process that takes a long time. And so there's a period of time, even when they're dead, that the remains will still act as if the individual is still alive. You'd get basically perimortem fractures, even though they happened after death. And we would see that. We would see that they had perimortem characteristics. Versus the ribs that I saw were very definitively postmortem. And like I said, they'd happened after a period of time because there was that color difference.
After decomposition process had begun
Yes.
and proceeded into the decomposition process.
Yes.
Thank you, Doctor.
Okay. Talking about the decomposition process and injury to the body post-mortem, the amount of force after death can affect the injury to the rib cavity, correct?
There could be force to that. Things like a cow stepping on the body, but it also could be just over time your body just kind of falls apart.
The weight of the soil.
Yeah, the weight of the soil.
Somebody stepping on the soil, correct?
Even excavation could be.
So there's no really firm conclusion that you can reach as to when the damage was done to the ribs other than this post-mortem, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any follow-up?
No, Your Honor.
Okay.
Excuse me.
All right, thank you for appearing today. You're excused from further testimony. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you approach, Your Honor?
Yeah, come on up. Please call your next witness.
Case called Edgar Perez.
All right, good afternoon. Please come up to the witness stand. Please be seated. Make yourself comfortable. Let me know when you're ready to proceed. Please state your full name for the record and spell your name as well, please.
Yes, my name is Edgar Perez. That's Edgar. Last name Perez.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that any testimony you give today shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Please introduce yourself to the jury.
Yes, my name is Edgar Perez, and I am currently employed at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in the Biology and DNA section of the Orlando Regional Operations Center.
How long have you worked there?
Approximately 17 years.
What do you do for them?
So currently I am one of the statewide assistant quality managers, particularly over the biology and DNA discipline, but when I worked this case, I was a crime laboratory analyst.
What would you do as a crime laboratory analyst?
So my duties as a crime laboratory analyst include processing items of evidence for the presence of body fluids, such as blood, semen, or saliva, in order to try to determine a good source of DNA. Once I'm able to isolate one of these stains, I would take a portion of it through a DNA process to generate a DNA profile that allows me to include or exclude an individual as a donor to that stain.
Can you describe for the jury your educational background and training that allows you to do that job?
I have 3 Bachelor of Science degrees from the University of Central Florida, 1 in chemistry, 1 in molecular and microbiology, and 1 in biology. I also have a Master's of Science degree from the University of Florida in pharmaceutical sciences with a focus on forensic serology and DNA, and also a graduate certificate in forensic death investigation, also from the University of Florida.
Have you been permitted in the past to give opinion testimony in a court of law regarding DNA analysis?
I have,
About how many times?
about 40 times.
DNA is kind of well understood at this point in time, but can you give the jury a very general, brief explanation of what DNA is?
Yes. DNA is an acronym, stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is a genetic blueprint that makes you who you are. You get half of it from your mother and half from your father, and that's what makes you very unique. It's found in virtually every single cell of your body, and it's very specific to you. Now, the fact that it's found in every cell in the body means that we could leave it behind pretty easily. And so it makes it useful forensically if you're able to obtain a piece of evidence, and then we can generate DNA profiles from it. Now, there are no two individuals in this world that have the same DNA profile except for identical twins.
Can you explain to the jury the general process that you go through when doing a DNA analysis? So you get a piece of evidence, let's do a known DNA standard. What do you do with it?
A known DNA standard is typically a swab from the inside of the mouth. It's like a Q-tip. And the reason it's taken from the inside of the mouth is that there's a lot of skin cells in there that are easy to slough off. So when it's collected, what I do is I take a small cutting of that Q-tip and I put it into a tube with chemicals, and I take it through a process known as extraction. And just like it sounds, I'm trying to extract or get that DNA out of those skin cells. The next portion of the testing is known as quantitation, where I'm trying to determine the quantity or the amount of DNA that's in that sample. And the reason I'm trying to do this is because the process of generating a DNA profile is very sensitive, and those instruments require specific amounts of DNA. And for that reason, the third portion of this is called amplification. And that is akin to a molecular Xeroxing process. So what I'm doing is I'm taking a sample of DNA and I'm making millions and millions of copies of that DNA. And the last portion of it is going to be genetic analysis, where that sample is then taken through an instrument to be able to develop a DNA profile that I can then compare to question samples.
What's a DNA profile?
So a DNA profile is a composite of, like I said, half of your DNA comes from your mother and half comes from your father. What I look at is something called a short tandem repeat profile, or STR-DNA analysis. And what it does is it counts the number of times that specific areas of the DNA repeat, and you get half of that copy from your mother and you get half from your father. And so you end up with two numbers. And I look at 21 locations to be able to determine what your specific DNA profile type is at each one of those locations.
So once you get that DNA profile from a known standard, can you then take that profile and compare it to unknown standards collected from a crime scene to see if they are consistent?
Yes.
What kind of results can you get when you do that comparison?
So if it's a single source profile, you could get a match, meaning that all the locations that I'm looking at match exactly. You could have a partial DNA profile, so you could have a match as well to partial profiles. If it's a DNA mixture, you could have an inclusion, because it's like a puzzle. There's multiple peoples in a sample, so you can only be included into a mixture. You could have an exclusion, meaning that you may not be present in that sample based on the visual comparison. You could also have a result that's determined to be no determination, meaning that I can't include or exclude you as a donor.
Let's talk about DNA or something in a swab from a crime scene, and you try to analyze that for the presence of DNA. Are you always able to get DNA?
Not always.
Why not?
So it varies. Depends on the source of the material. If we're talking about a concentrated body fluid, my expectation is that I would be able to develop some type of DNA result from it. With other types of samples that are left out in the environment, exposure to things like heat, humidity, moisture, bacteria, ultraviolet light, harsh chemicals can degrade DNA over time. And so the expectation is, even if you have a really robust sample from blood or semen, if you leave it out in the environment, it's going to degrade over time.
Is there anything in your analysis or your testing method that could cause DNA from changing from one profile to another profile?
No, there's nothing in my testing or any process that I perform in the laboratory that would be able to change a DNA profile.
Do you, as well as your lab, go through proficiency testing to make sure you know what you're doing the process correctly?
Yes, all analysts are required to do proficiency testing every 6 months.
Were you provided some evidence collected in the case of State of Florida versus Laurie Shaver, Lake County Sheriff's Office case 180025431?
I was.
I want to start with some questions pertaining to the identification of the victim in this case. Were you provided a buccal swab or a known DNA standard from a person named Douglas Shaver?
Yes, I was.
So you must have introduced in evidence in State's Exhibit 8. Did you analyze that item for the presence of DNA?
I did.
And did you use the same process, that four-step process you just described to the jury?
Yes.
were you able to obtain DNA information or a DNA profile from the known standards of Douglas Shaver?
Yes, I obtained a complete DNA profile from the sample.
So now that you have a complete DNA profile from Douglas Shaver, are you able to compare that profile to something collected at the scene to see if those profiles match, or if, let's say in this case, a femur bone originated from a biological child of Douglas Shaver?
Yes.
How do you do that?
For a sample from a femur, I would take a small cutting of the bone and subject it to the DNA extraction process, very similar to this one, with some additional chemicals and steps to be able to remove the calcium, because the calcium in the bone can prevent me from getting a DNA profile downstream in my testing. But once I'm able to take that sample from the femur all the way forward through DNA, I would end up generating a DNA profile if it's a viable sample. And then I can get that DNA profile and compare it to the one from this standard or the Q-tip from the inside of the mouth and make comparisons to it.
Did you in fact receive a femur bone from the Lake County Sheriff's Office?
Yes, I did.
Showing photograph 21 of States 19 as well as showing you States 22. Do you recognize that item?
I do.
And is that the femur bone that you analyzed?
That'd be correct.
Did you in fact take cuttings from that femur or take portions of that femur bone to use in your DNA analysis?
Yes.
Did you perform DNA analysis on those portions of the femur bone that you removed?
I did.
And what were your results?
From the femur bone, I was able to obtain a complete DNA profile that was consistent with originating from a male individual.
How do you know it came from a male?
As part of the DNA process, there is an area that's called a melogenin, and it's a sex-determining marker. Basically, if you have an X and an X, you're a female. If you have an X and a Y, biologically, you are considered a male.
So did you then compare that male DNA profile that you obtained from the femur to the known DNA standards obtained from Douglas Shaver?
Yes, in this particular situation, that would consist of me doing a parentage type of analysis, since I am dealing with a sample that is from an alleged parent to an alleged biological child.
So how are you able to then tell whether the femur bone was from a biological child of Douglas Shaver by doing this analysis?
Yeah, so when the DNA profile was obtained from the femur bone, it was compared to the profile from Douglas Shaver, and during that comparison, it was determined that it's consistent with being the biological child of Douglas Shaver. And the single parentage index, which is an odds ratio, comparing the probability of the observed profile that was obtained from Michael Douglas Shaver coming from the biological parent versus some other unrelated random individual in the population. And that probability was 21,000. Now, I also did a single parentage probability of exclusion calculation, which is the chance that a random individual will be correctly excluded as a biological parent, and that is approximately 99.99%.
So is it fair to say the DNA from the femur bone is consistent with coming from the biological child of Douglas Shaver?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, pursuant to stipulation by the parties, the state would move into evidence State's Exhibit Q, which is a DNA standard taken from the defendant, Laurie Shaver.
All right, without objection, State's Q will come into evidence as State's number 25.
Thank you. Give us the clerk first, and I'll give it back to you. Did you receive a DNA standard from Laurie Shaver?
I did.
Did you analyze that item for the presence of DNA to see if you could develop a DNA profile?
I did, and I obtained a complete DNA profile from the sample as well.
I'm going to refer you to some other pieces of evidence that you received from the Lake County Sheriff's Office. Did you receive some fingernail and toenails collected from the scene of a grave in which a skeleton was located? Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
So what's introduced into evidence is State's Exhibit 21. Did you analyze those finger and toenails for the presence of DNA?
Yes, I did.
What were your results?
When these samples were submitted through the DNA process, they went through the process of quantitation that I described before to figure out the amount of DNA in the sample, and unfortunately, those samples failed to demonstrate a sufficient amount of DNA to go forward through the complete DNA analysis process.
So there was just not enough DNA there for you to even do any kind of analysis?
That's correct.
Well, if we know their finger and toenails, how could that be?
It depends on the condition of them. If we're dealing with a sample that was exposed to environmental conditions like I previously described, DNA that could be found in the nail bed could be degrading over time, or there may just not be any DNA there present.
Could DNA degrade over time even if a body was buried under the ground and not in the direct heat and things like that?
Yes, there are soil humectants and bacteria that would eventually start degrading the DNA.
So is that at all surprising that you weren't able to find sufficient DNA from those finger and toenails to do any kind of a comparison?
Not at all.
Were you also provided some boxer shorts and some other shorts to analyze for the presence of DNA?
I was.
Showing you was introduced in States Exhibit 4. Do you recognize that item?
I do.
Did you analyze that item for the presence of DNA?
Yes, for this specific item, when I'm describing the boxer the shorts, the black shorts, I did test for the presence of semen on there, and it failed to give chemical indications for the presence of semen. A sample was also taken from that item for DNA, and it was, again, submitted through the DNA process through quantitation. It failed to demonstrate sufficient amounts of DNA at quantitation to go forward with a complete DNA process.
Again, considering that those shorts were found buried in the ground, does that surprise you?
No, it does not.
Did you do any analysis of the underwear, the boxer shorts?
There was no examinations performed on the underwear due to the condition of the exhibit.
And what was wrong with it? What do you mean by the condition?
The exhibit was decomposed and shredded. There's just absolutely no way that I could conceivably swab any portion of it for DNA.
Did you analyze a blue tarp provided to you for the presence of DNA?
Yes, I did.
Show you has been introduced in States Exhibit 1. Do you recognize that item?
I do.
And how did you analyze that blue tarp for the presence of DNA?
So the blue tarp would have been swabbed with a similar swab as it's used inside of to collect the inside of the mouth. It's just a giant Q-tip. I would swab the surface of the item to collect any type of DNA that could have been transferred onto the item, and then subjected it to the DNA analysis process.
What were your results when you tried to lift DNA for this tarp?
When the sample was sent through the DNA process, it reached the point of quantitation, and when it got there wasn't sufficient amounts of DNA to go forward with the DNA process.
Again, considering that tarp was buried in the ground, does that surprise you at all that there was insufficient DNA for you to even analyze?
No, it does not.
Showing you a green strap and a container with some other debris collected from the grave site. States Exhibit 3. Did you analyze that item for the presence of DNA?
Yes, I did.
What were your results?
Similar to with the blue tarp, the sample went through up to quantitation, and there was insufficient amounts of DNA to go forward with STR-DNA analysis.
And that was from what item did you attempt to extract DNA?
This would have been the green nylon strap, and there's a white elastic strap as well.
Did you analyze the items contained in the Tupperware at all?
No, the exhibit that was listed as miscellaneous items from the gravesite was not examined.
Why not?
There was no way of me collecting DNA from those items, and the expectation is that I would not obtain DNA profiles from the condition of them.
I'm showing you a swab taken from the exterior track of a sliding glass door, States Exhibit 17. Did you analyze that item for the presence of DNA?
Yes, I did.
What were your results?
There were no STR-DNA results obtained from this exhibit.
What does that mean?
That means that there was not even a single peak present when it was taken through the entire DNA process.
So no DNA at all in that swab.
No.
Showing you a swab from a stain below the sliding glass door under the back porch. States Exhibit 18. Did you analyze that item for the presence of DNA?
Yes, I did.
And what did you find?
So the sample went through the DNA process. It reached the point of quantitation, and it was determined that there was insufficient amounts of DNA to go forward with the DNA analysis process.
Considering that this sample was collected on the exterior of a house, does that surprise you?
No, it does not.
For the same reasons you previously described?
Yes.
Showing you States Exhibit 16, a swab taken from the interior sliding door track from the sliding glass door of the residence. Did you analyze that item for the presence of DNA?
I did.
And what did you find?
So this particular sample demonstrated the presence of a mixture consistent with 3 donors, including at least 1 male.
And what does that mean?
When I obtained a mixture, like I was saying, you get half of the DNA from your mother and half from your father. I'm only expecting 2 pieces of DNA information at each location that I look at. If I see more than 2 pieces of information at multiple locations, it gives me an indication that there are multiple donors to that sample or multiple DNA profiles. So it's creating effectively a DNA puzzle.
In this case, you indicated that there were 3 donors,
Yes, that's correct.
and one of the donors was male.
Yes, at least 1 donor was a male.
And how did you determine that at least one donor was male?
In the DNA process, you can only see the XX or the XY once. It's not like different males have different Y chromosomes. So if there is a male in a sample, I can only tell that there's at least 1 because of the presence of the Y chromosome.
Are you sometimes able to separate out the DNA profiles contained in a mixture and compare it to known DNA samples?
Yes, it's possible.
Briefly, how do you do that?
So it's not the process of necessarily picking out individuals from a sample, but more so what I do is I use a software called StarMix. It's a computational software that does biological and mathematical calculations to see what best explains a DNA mixture. And so when you take the DNA sample, the DNA mixture, and put it into the software, it does hundreds of thousands of calculations to see what type of DNA combinations fit at each one of those locations, given that it's a 3-person mixture.
Are you able to tell the source of the DNA that you found on that swab? Meaning, was it saliva, blood, sweat, semen, things like that?
No, I would not be able to tell you the source.
Did you compare the known profile of Douglas Shaver to the mixture that you found on the swab from the interior portion of the sliding glass door?
Yes, I did.
What were your results?
Douglas Shaver was excluded as a contributor to that mixed DNA profile.
He was excluded?
Yes.
Meaning Douglas Shaver's DNA could not have been part of that mixture.
Based on his DNA profile, it's not conceivable that it fits into that mixture as it stands.
Did you compare the DNA profile from the femur, purportedly the femur of Michael Shaver, to the DNA mixture you found from the swab from the interior of that sliding glass door?
I did.
And what were your results?
The comparison of the profile from Michael Douglas Shaver failed to demonstrate sufficient statistical support for inclusion or exclusion. Therefore, I can't make any determinations as to the presence of Michael Douglas Shaver on this item.
So what do you mean by failed to give general or statistical support? Sorry.
In that particular situation, the statistical calculation that I performed was not sufficiently high enough for me to reach an area that I can conclusively tell you that somebody is present in a sample or is not adventitiously or falsely included into the sample.
So bottom line, you can't tell scientifically if Michael Shaver was a contributor to that mixture, correct?
No, I cannot.
Did you compare the known DNA profile of Laurie Shaver to the mixture from that swab in the interior of the sliding glass door?
I did.
What were your results?
So Laurie Shaver was included as a possible contributor to this DNA mixture, and it was approximately 3.1 billion times more likely to occur if the sample originated from Laurie Shaver and 2 unrelated individuals than from 3 unrelated individuals.
Did you also analyze a piece of vinyl laminate flooring recovered from a fire pit, showing you States Exhibit 6?
Yes, I did.
And before we get to the laminate flooring, if this, referring back to the swab from the interior sliding glass door, would a profile consistent with Laurie Shaver's DNA be included in that mixture, would that be surprising considering that this was her house when she lived there?
Not necessarily.
Okay. Referring to the laminate flooring that we just talked about, did you analyze that item for the presence of DNA?
Of this particular item,
Presence of blood.
yes. So I did a serological test for the presence of blood.
And what does that involve?
It's basically a chemical color change test. So I would take a small piece of filter paper or a cotton tip swab and take a small rubbing from the item to get some transfer of any stains that I see on the item. And then I would perform the chemical color change test to see if it gives me chemical indications for the possible presence of blood.
And what were the results of that chemical blood test?
So this particular exhibit failed to give chemical indications for the presence of blood.
Did you do any further DNA analysis on that item?
No, I did not.
Why not?
At that point, if I don't have an indication of the presence of a fluid, then I'm not expecting to get any DNA except for any extraneous type that might be there. And given that it's a piece of random material from the environment, who knows what you can pick up from it if you swab it.
Thank you, sir. I have no other questions, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Wiggs?
May it please the court.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Perez, how are you doing, sir?
Hey, good yourself?
Good, good. Recall I took your deposition
Yes,
several years ago.
it was. It's been some time. Yeah.
Yeah, it has been a while. I had your report, reviewed it, and discussed it with you at your deposition. And throughout your direct examination, the state talked to you about multiple exhibits, items that were found in the gravesite, correct?
That's correct.
And you used the terminology degraded versus none, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Is it not a fact that there could have been DNA present, or there might have been DNA present at some time, but what you were able to examine didn't have any DNA on it?
It's a possibility.
Okay. So aside from saying that the evidence was degraded, it may be that it never had any DNA on it, correct?
Yes, there is a possibility that there was not DNA in an object.
So when the states asked you, does it surprise you, does it surprise you, does it surprise you, and you've stated, no, not given the condition of the item, it may be the item may never have had any DNA on it, correct?
Yes, that is a possibility.
Okay. So we're looking at your report. Do you have a copy of your report before you?
I did.
Okay. Let's go to the door, okay, and the rear track. Were you ever able to determine anybody's DNA in that region of the track?
Could you
Yes.
determine which report
was
and which
some-
exhibit?
Let me see. Number 23. Okay. What was your conclusion?
The only comparison that I was able to provide an inclusion for was for the profile of Laurie Shaver. To that
Okay.
mixture of 3 donors.
Okay, there was 3 donors, including at least 1 male contributor.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Whose known male contributor profiles were you supplied?
I was given the DNA profile from Douglas Shaver and then the profile from the femur, which was also a male individual, which was represented as being Michael Douglas Shaver.
Those were the only profiles that were provided by the state attorney's office, correct?
Yes.
And that was recovered, to your understanding, on the lower region of the doorway, correct?
Based on the description from the item, yes. I was never there when it was collected, so I have to go based on what the contributing agency wrote for the description of the evidence.
Right. So on the blue tarp that we spoke about, there was no DNA recovered, correct? Just to make this clear.
There was insufficient amounts of DNA to go forward
Okay.
with DNA.
Insufficient meaning, again, as we've spoken, there may never have been any, correct?
So in this particular sample, when I took it through the quantitation process, there was an indication of potentially DNA being present, but if it doesn't hit a specific threshold, the sample doesn't go forward for DNA analysis.
Okay. So there was a lack of evidence on that item, correct?
Yes.
And every item that was supplied to you dealing with the gravesite, none of those had any profile hits for Laurie Shaver, correct?
Not that I am aware of.
Okay. The linoleum or the flooring that was supplied to you, that had no profile or hit of any DNA containing Laurie Shaver, correct?
For that piece of the floor tile, I only tested it for blood, and I stopped processing after it didn't give chemical indications for the presence of blood.
Okay. Were there any hairs found in the gravesite location that were supplied to you?
I believe Exhibit 22, there were hairs associated with that exhibit.
Okay. And did they yield any kind of profile of any individual?
So for the hairs that I examined from the exhibit, which were the swabs from the stain on the siding below the sliding door under the back porch, so there were some apparent hairs that were also submitted with that. I looked at those hairs under the microscope, and they were not suitable to go forward with DNA processing.
Okay. So the hairs couldn't even yield any DNA profile, correct?
Based on the analysis that I performed in the lab, those hairs were not suitable to go forward. That's not to say that there are other laboratories that may potentially do other types of testing on hairs, but based on the limitations that I have in the laboratory, I couldn't test those hairs.
Were those sent to any other laboratory for further testing?
Not to my knowledge.
Did you test any object in the house that was supplied to you that contained any DNA from Laurie Shaver?
There were no exhibits that had any association to Laurie Shaver except for that one from the interior lower track of the sliding door, which was Exhibit 23.
Correct. One moment, please.
Yes, sir.
No further questions. Thank you, Judge.
All right, redirect.
Very briefly, the hairs that you talked about that you said were not suitable, is that because they're 23?
Yeah, so when I look at it microscopically, I examine the root to see if it's in the correct stage of growth or if it has follicular material, meaning there's skin cells that were pulled off from your scalp onto the hair. And I didn't notice either of these, so the hairs were not sent forward for DNA analysis because those are the two characteristics that I look at when I'm taking hairs for DNA.
Thank you, sir. No other questions.
Mr. Wiggs?
No, nothing further. Thank you, Judge.
All right. Well, thank you for appearing today. You're excused from further testimony. Have a good day.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Yes, sir. All right, yes, sir. All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, thank you again for your time and attention today. Again, should you see the attorneys out and about today or tonight, they have been instructed to ignore you, so please don't hold that against them. Please do not discuss the case with anyone, including each other. Please do not view any media, whether it's TV, news, internet, and please do not do any research. All right, we'll see you tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock in the jury assembly room. Thank you and have a good night.
Your Honor,
Yes,
so we
sir.
just have a brief conversation about kind of how the rest of the week is going to go.
Certainly.
So we are pretty much on schedule. There were two witnesses that I was hoping to get in today that were going to be fairly short, but obviously when I knew that we were calling the DNA analyst at 4:45, I sent them home, told them to come back in the morning. So far we are pretty much on track from what I've been telling the court as far as where we were going to be.
How many more witnesses do you have?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, probably about 15.
15.
And which would include a couple, that number 15 includes one that's going to be called twice, so 14 people, about 15 witnesses.
All
So
right.
I think we are still definitely on track to turn it over to the defense on Thursday.
Thursday.
It might be first thing on Thursday, but I would anticipate that they could start putting on their defense sometime on Thursday.
Possibly Thursday afternoon.
I think they'll be able to start Thursday morning, but I can give you a better update about that maybe
All right.
at lunch tomorrow, and also Mr. Wiggs. And we do anticipate rebuttal. If Mr. Wiggs has any sort of approximate time, I'm not asking him to tell me who his witnesses are going to be or anything like that, but if he has an approximate amount of time of how long he thinks it's going to take to put on his defense.
So that there are no time restrictions upon you, Mr. Wiggs, but if you can give an estimate, there are no time restrictions.
I listed Mr. Connor, okay, the tech guy, there'll be Isabel. I don't know if Laurie intends to testify or not. Travis, he would be called, Mr. Narvaez. So we have like 5 witnesses, and they're going to be relatively brief. The longest one would be probably Isabel and Mr. Connor. Okay?
So
it's probably one day,
one day.
I would envision.
So it's unlikely that will conclude on Thursday, but unlikely that we will conclude Thursday, but potentially on Friday.
Yeah, there'd be Kelly Johnson as a lineup witness for the minor.
Yes, sir.
Okay?
All right.
Also, just to
And again, Mr. Wiggs, take as much time as you need. No time restrictions have been placed upon you, so
Okay, thank you,
as
Judge.
much time as you need.
I would ask that Thursday, when we are done with whatever is being presented to the jury, that we spend a little bit of time with the charge conference. Obviously, we can't do a final one until Ms. Shaver makes her determination whether or not she's going to testify, but there are some proposed instructions by Mr. Wiggs that we're going to have to discuss. And I would just like to at least start that process at the conclusion of Thursday to keep us on track and on schedule. I will also say that I anticipate having a motion filed as it relates to Ms. Johnson's testimony probably tomorrow morning that I'll present to the court about those issues that came up during yesterday. I'll have that completed and we can discuss that at some other time outside the presence of the jury. Those are kind of just the procedural issues that I wanted to go through and just make sure everyone is on the same page and kind of go from there.
All right, is there anything further?
Nothing today, Judge.
Okay, we'll adjourn. We'll reconvene tomorrow at 8:30.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are adjourned.
The system's rigged, man, it's time to break free. Eyes wide open, gotta see what I see. Standing on the front lines, fighting for the truth. Lift the veil of lies, it's time to be the proof. Take a stand, don't you back down. Raise your voice, let's shake the town. We're the voices that won't be ignored. Breaking chains, yeah, we're ready for war. With the power of the people, we'll make them see a world of justice, united and free. United and free. United and free. Marching with a purpose, we're taking it higher. Fighting through the struggle, igniting the fire. No more silence, we'll make the noise loud. Together in this battle, standing strong and proud. Injustice fades when courage aligns. Rise up together.